Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, brought to you by the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling. Richard, welcome back to the show for another week.
It's great to be here again with you and, of course, our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, I thought we would discuss one of your favorite subjects and one of the things that you love celebrating all the time, and that is government holidays. I'm sure that you were just resting and relaxing yesterday on Labor Day because the government gave you permission to do so. And I know how much...
Actually, here at the Citadel, classes were held yesterday.
Oh, I stand corrected.
Yes, but I don't teach on Mondays, so I was home.
Okay, so you were celebrating Labor Day regardless.
No, I was in urgent care.
Okay. Well, I thought it would be a good thing to discuss since we very rarely discuss labor generally from a libertarian perspective. And I think it would be helpful to bring some different insights. I know there's various aspects to the concept of labor. You know, there's the minimum wage and unions and right to strike. But I thought I would start out the discussion by just giving a general concept of the relationship of labor to capital or to employers. We're all taught as kids that there's this conflict of interest, that employers are just trying to exploit workers and that you need all these laws to protect workers from exploitation. I mean, it really goes back to the old Marxian theory of value, that the product, the value of anything that comes into existence that's produced in a factory or a business is done by the workers through their labor. And so whatever is taken out in terms of profit by the employer or the owner of the business is really stealing from the worker. So you need laws to protect us against it, protect the worker against this. Well, we're all taught with that. We're imbued with that concept that there's this conflict of interest, that there's a fight between owners and employees. Well, then I discovered libertarianism and especially the writings of Frederick Bastiat, the famous French 19th century free market legislator. It taught me that it was totally opposite from that there is a harmony of interest between employers and owners of businesses. For one thing, it's the owner of the business that risks his own capital, his own savings, when he starts a business. If it goes under, he's the guy that's going to be losing everything. And he brings this business into existence and offers employment to workers who might not otherwise be employed. And so they're both benefiting from this exchange. And then once the business gets going, the workers have a vested interest in making sure it succeeds because this is their means of livelihood. They're guaranteed a paycheck every week. They're not risking their capital like the owner is. And over time, how is it that wages start rising? Well, we're all taught as kids that employers will pay a subsistence wage. If the government's not in there with minimum wage laws and other rules and regulations, the workers will die of starvation. And well, as I learned from Bastiat and Henry Hazlitt and other famous free market libertarian economists, that in the competitive process, when there's a dynamic economy, lots of businesses are starting up and lots of businesses are prospering. And so they have to pay their workers higher amounts of money in order to keep them, because the guy next door is going to be offering a higher wage rate. And the way they're able to offer these higher wage rates is through increased productivity, because as the business starts growing and starts producing more, there's more resources available to pay. And so through this free market dynamic process, it's a system that benefits everyone. It benefits the consumers because they're getting all these goods and services, hopefully over a long period of time at reduced prices. The workers are benefiting. They have jobs and then increasing pay because of the multiplicity of firms that are offering employment. The owners are profiting. So it's a system, this free market system, in which there is a harmony of interest, as Bastiat called, for everybody involved. What's your take on this?
Well, I'll just amplify on some of the themes that you have correctly brought out. And let me do so with the interpretation given by a famous Austrian economist named Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, one of the great members of the Austrian school in the late 19th and early 20th century. Among other things, he was known as a major critic of Marx and the Marxian theory of value and the Marxian rationale of exploitation. And the particular slant or theme that he gave to it, which is a compliment to what you say, is that besides the entrepreneur, the capitalist, risking his own money, he's performing another service, and that is he is saving the worker from the need to wait until the product is sold to receive his salary remuneration. Now, what was Böhm-Bawerk saying here? He argued that the primary concept that Marx had confused and conflated were the distinctions between profit and interest. Now, profit is the difference between what you earn as revenue and the expenses or the monetary costs that you've incurred in bringing a product to market. Now, Böhm-Bawerk emphasized that if a market is open and competitive, eventually profits are competed away. If I can sell a good product that I can sell at a price greater than what it's cost me to manufacture it, and if that's persistent over a period of time, rivals are going to notice this, and over time they will enter my corner, my part of the market, and try to offer a better good, a less expensive good, a variation good, and to capture the consumer business and the profits which they see I have been earning. And over time, that competition will compete the profits away. So that taking the long-run view of the tendencies in the market, competition assures that profits are basically competed away to zero. But what is persistent in the market is interest. Interest is basically the price of money over and across time. Some people are willing to put part of their income aside as savings and lend it to others, often, if not primarily, for investment purposes. And they're willing to do this if they receive a premium, a net gain in the future. I forego $100 today as savings to lend to someone who maybe promises me $105 a year from now. And that increment of net gain, the premium over that sum today, is the interest income I earn by deferring consumption in the present for the promise of being able to have my money back in greater consumption with that interest net income in the future. On the other hand, there is the borrower. He would prefer to have a greater sum of money for current uses, such as to undertake an investment now and over a period of time. He values that more highly than the interest he'd have to pay in the future, because he thinks that the sum now, using it for an investment, will then enable him to have a product to sell in the future that will facilitate his ability to pay back the principal and the interest and still earn, hopefully, a profit margin above that. So interest is the price of the trading of goods and resources across time. What Böhm-Bawerk said, the market reflection of people's different time valuations, time preferences. Now, what the businessman, the entrepreneur does is that he uses his own savings to invest in his firm, or he uses the borrowed savings of others. Now, with virtually all methods of production, everything takes time. If I clear the field, lay the farrows, plant the seed, irrigate it, tend it, shoo away the crows as the crop is growing until the harvest comes, time passes. I cannot eat the crop that I'm growing until it's ready and matured to harvest time. The product goes through, metaphorically as well as sometimes literally, a conveyor belt, where there's the beginning of the production process. It goes through the stages on the conveyor belt until, for example, in the auto factory, what began as a bare chassis at the beginning of the assembly line becomes the finished automobile that can go to the showroom to be sold. All production takes time. And during that time, if the workers who the businessman employed was going to have to wait until the product had been finished and sold for the businessman to then compensate them for their labor contribution to the production process, those workers would have to be living off their own savings until their remuneration was available in the form of the finished and sold product. But Bobrock argued that what the employer basically does is that during the production process, he is advancing wages to the workers. I don't have to wait, let's say, a year from now until the crop has matured and the farmer who hired me to assist him has sold the crop for him to pay me my salary. No, he pays me over the year while the crop is being planted and maturing and then harvesting every day and every week. So he is advancing me his savings or the borrowed savings of others, and therefore saving me the need to wait till the production process over the period of production has been completed. Now, what Bobrock said is that since profits are basically temporary and eventually competed away, what you have to understand is that the worker who, let's say, receives $90 today, and over the period of the production process, and then sees that the businessman sells that product for $100 a year from now, is not exploiting him. But what the worker is receiving is his discounted value of his labor time over the production process, since the businessman and his creditors have to wait till the product is sold and an interest income has been earned that can be paid to compensate for foregoing the use of that savings over that period of time. That is what the employer is giving the worker. He's advancing wages so the worker does not have to wait until the product is done. In addition, what the businessman is doing is not only investing his own savings in paying workers' wages, purchasing resources, acquiring machinery to assist the workers in the manufacturing process, he is also bearing that risk, that uncertainty that you mentioned, Jacob. Because he has a vision and anticipation that at some point in the future, consumers might be willing to buy product X. But he can't have product X ready to sell until the production process has been completed. Now, there's no certainty that the consumers will want his product or will be willing to pay a price that will be sufficient to compensate him for all of his expenses, any savings he's borrowed from others, which requires him to pay an interest income to them, or the wages and the resource prices and the capital machinery costs that he's have to incur. He's what the economists call the residual claimant. He's only going to get what's left over after he's incurred all of these contractual expenses, including the wages to his workers, if he has correctly read the tea leaves of the market that consumers will want it and will pay price X instead of X minus 2. So therefore, he's the provider of savings. So the worker is saved the cost of having to live off his own savings during the production process. He's the visionary who imagines the product that may be sold in the future successfully, and he bears the risk uncertainty that his entrepreneurial judgment may be wrong. And in that sense, and contrary to Barack Obama a few years ago, yes, the businessman, he did make it. He made the factory. He hired the workers. He oversaw the vision of a product to make available to consumers and may have earned a profit if he anticipated correctly what consumers might want when that future date came. That is what he does, and that makes him the productive and indispensable complement to the actual physical worker who may do some physical labor in the production and factory location.
Yeah, and then it makes sense as to why he's entitled to the profits that he's receiving. I mean, this is his compensation for taking the risk, risking his own capital, his own savings in order to start a business in which there is no guaranteed result. We should keep in mind that every worker that receives a paycheck has entered into an exchange with that employer that is to his benefit. Both sides benefit from the exchange. Otherwise, they wouldn't enter into it. And so this idea that, the employer is making so much more money than the employee is clearly fallacious, because there's no guarantee for the owner. As you point out, at the very end of this process, let's assume that the crop is destroyed through a freeze, and he ends up with nothing to sell. He can't go back to the workers and say, I want my money back, because that was the benefit to the workers, that their money was guaranteed, as you point out, through the production process. And there are no guarantees for the owner. he is risking all that money that he's paying the employee week after week after week. He's risking the money he's invested in the hose, the tractors, all the things, the seeds. And so at the end of this thing, if he makes a big profit, that's his reward for having done what he does, and that is take the risk of opening and operating this business. Let's get into the area of labor unions. That's always been somewhat of a controversial field within libertarianism. And Richard, it seems to me that libertarians stand for the proposition that unions are fine. I mean, this notion that libertarians are against unions is really fallacious. That workers have a right to come together and form organizations within businesses so long as that's consistent with the terms of employment. That the employer has the right to set the terms of employment. It's his business. That's what private ownership is. If a prospective employee doesn't like the terms, he doesn't have to work there. He can go elsewhere. So when an employer opens a business, he might very well say, hey, look, in this business, you guys are free to form a union or form two unions. That's fine. That's going to be one of the conditions for my business. Guy next door may open a business and say, well, I'm going to prohibit any unions operating in my business. That's just as much his right as the other guy. And if workers don't like it, they don't have to work there. So it seems to me that this is all part of private ownership of business and a free market system where the employers and businesses, and oftentimes in response to laws of supply and demand, if there's a shortage, a scarcity of labor, the employers might have to agree to terms that they don't really like. If there's an abundance of labor, then the employer is setting the terms of employment in his business. But it's all done through mutual consent. And especially if you have a dynamic growing economy with lots of businesses opening up, lots of businesses prospering, you're likely to have a multiplicity of options for employees to choose from. Am I off base on this, Richard?
No, you're not. Now, it is true that in the 1800s and for the 1700s and for part of the early 1800s, that is the 18th and the early part of the 19th century, it was very common in European countries for labor union combinations to be prohibited by law. This was considered undue restraint of trade. Now, sometimes there were similar ones for business, but these restrictions on business were lifted before the restrictions on unions. And it was correct, as you point out just now, that the classical liberal, the free market principle should be the right of freedom of association. And therefore, it was inconsistent with that concept of freedom of association for labor combination associations to be made illegal. And as long as the worker association is free and voluntary, the advocate of freedom has to not only support it, but be enthusiastic of the right of people to form associations for any purpose they want, including a collective negotiation for worker conditions and wages if the members choose to. What became a problem beginning in the late 19th and then particularly certainly through the first half and then into the post-war period of the 20th century, was the fact that increasingly governments gave unions the power to act in compulsory ways, sometimes tacitly, and that is looking the other way, a lot of times through legislation that enabled unions to impose membership for the ability to make a living in certain professions, occupations, or trades. In other words, a closed shop. If you wanted to be employed in the automobile industry in Detroit, if you wanted to work in a textile mill, if you wanted to work in a steel mill, if you wanted to work on the docks as a longshoreman on the East Coast or the West Coast or along the Gulf of Mexico, you could not be employed. The employer could not hire you, and a desiring worker could not be gainfully given a job unless he had joined against his will in a union who would take dues from him, who if a strike was called that closed down a business because the employer was not immediately willing to accept the terms that the union was demanding, that worker who was compelled to be a union member had to defer to that union in stopping to work and losing his paycheck, and to collaborate, if not violently, at least tacitly and passively, with the union's ability to picket and prevent non-union members from filling those positions, which they would have found attractive to on mutual terms with the willing employers. It was when unions became compulsory and became thuggish. That hasn't been going on as much, certainly in the United States over the last few decades, but throughout the, let's say, from the teens to the 20s to the 30s, 40s, 50s, even into the 1960s, certainly, unions would shut down entire segments of the U.S. economy because of their control of those segments of the labor market by law. And they would use violent methods to prevent anyone from entering those private enterprises for gainful employment, because they viewed that as their right to those jobs to which they could use force to prevent anyone from taking their places. It was the compulsory nature of unions that was the problem. Now, that has changed somewhat. There has been an increasing number of states that have moved towards right to work. For example, before I moved here to South Carolina for my current teaching position at the Citadel, I lived in Michigan for many long times, most immediately Midland, where I was teaching at Northwood University. But Midland was notoriously a closed shop state. You couldn't belong to professions and occupations without union membership. And what happened is that, among other misguided government policies, that rigidity of the labor market helped bring down Detroit, and particularly the auto industry. Well, a few years ago, the state of Michigan became a right-to-work state. That is, you couldn't be compelled in most occupations to belong to a union for gainful employment. And slowly but surely, and through the modification or revision of some other economic policies, I don't want to just say unionism alone, Michigan is beginning, however modestly, a significant economic renaissance by the flexibility and adaptability and the freedom of association in labor markets. And if I may be allowed to do this, when I was still in Michigan, I participated in a commission that did a report for the Michigan Chamber of Commerce on the case for right to work, which influenced the governor to support right to work legislation. And that change about 4 years ago now, maybe 4 years, has helped transform the Michigan. South Carolina is a right-to-work state. Workers are not starving. They're seeing competitive wages. Why? Because of the flexibility and adaptability of the labor market here. Industry has been coming in. This is becoming the seaport entry and exit for much of what is going on east of the Mississippi for the United States. Right here in Charleston Harbor, Volvo has opened plants. Boeing has a massive facility here by the airport. Why? Because it is a flexible and adaptable labor market in which unions don't try to strangle the employer with demands that give power to the labor union leaders and basically lock workers in and out of jobs that the market would be offering them and nudging them to move into one direction or another for their own long-run gain. That is the danger of labor unions, not the existence, but the use of force to compel membership or to prevent others from working where they otherwise would peacefully choose to do.
Yeah, that's a great point, that when they started turning to government into state coercion, that's when all the problems started. And it sounds to me like what you're saying is that workers are starting to figure that out and realizing that this is a real detriment to their interests when the government gets involved in these transactions. You mentioned the striking, and that's a fascinating concept. I remember when I first discovered the Libertarian movement many years ago, coming across an essay entitled "There Is No Right to Strike." And that struck me as somewhat odd. As why doesn't a person have a right to strike? Well, here's the reasoning. That, as you pointed out, no one's got a right to any particular job. I mean, you have a right to go in there and ask for a job, and the employer has a right to grant you a job. But most contracts are at will. They're not 1 or 2 or 3 years. But if they are, the employer has to comply with the contract. So does the employee. But the idea of striking is really like a temporary resignation, from what I can see, is that certainly anybody's got a right to quit. I mean, assuming that, he doesn't have a long-term contract and it's an at-will situation, he has a right to just walk off. But strike, when it comes to a strike, that's not what employees are doing. They're not saying, I don't like the wages I'm getting paid, I don't like the work conditions, so I'm leaving to go elsewhere. Everybody acknowledges that right exists. This is something different. This is where they walk outside and begin picketing a particular business for higher wages. And the idea is to put a squeeze on the businessman that he's losing market share, he's losing sales because he doesn't have workers there or enough workers. And so the idea is, hey, if you want to get back to full production, you're going to have to give us what we want. Now, technically, they're out there on a public sidewalk or a public street. Theoretically, they're not on private property, and they're out there just holding up their signs. And from a libertarian standpoint, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, they're not violating anybody's rights to do that. The problem arises is when the employer decides to hire substitute workers, which he has every right to do. Somebody walks off a job and is holding this sign out there demanding higher wages. The employer can look out into the labor market and say, hey, are there other people willing to take this job? And if there aren't, then he may have to negotiate and accept terms that he doesn't like. But if there's other workers willing to take the job, which oftentimes there are, then he simply hires them. The violence that comes in here is when the strikers were realizing this, realizing that their jobs are being taken by others and they have effectively lost the jobs that they were over there picketing, they start initiating violence against what they call the scabs, these replacement workers. And from a libertarian standpoint, they don't have a right to do that. They don't have a right to initiate force against someone who has accepted a job that formerly belonged to that person who's striking. And that's what the thrust of the article is. In terms of no right to strike, the idea was that you don't have a right to initiate force against another employer and against that employee to prevent them from hiring substitute workers. And it seems to me that's the right position, that from a libertarian standpoint, that you don't have a right to interfere in a violent way with that new labor relationship.
Yeah, if I can sort of offer some bibliography here for the interested listener or viewer, there's two very good books by a British economist named William H. Hutt, W.H. Hutt. One is called The Theory of Collective Bargaining, and the other is called The Strike Threat System. Both of those, I believe, are available online in PDFs for free. And the other one is by an economist named Sylvester Petro, P-E-T-R-O, called The Labor Policy of the Free Society. I highly recommend those to understand the legitimate rights and freedom of association of workers within an association, but not the violent nature. And then, if I could just mention something else, since it's a rare thing, I think most viewers and listeners are familiar with the famous 1950s and 60s actor Marlon Brando. He actually did what is, in essence, an anti-labor union movie called On the Waterfront. He's a longshoreman in Hoboken, New Jersey, and there's corrupt union leadership. And he, at the end of the day, bucks a strike and goes on the dock to work. And it's a challenging movie with Rod Steiger as well as Marlon Brando and I think even Marie Saint on anti-labor. And finally, one other movie, which is really hard to find, but I really recommend, is called Sometimes a Great Notion, with Henry Fonda, Paul Newman, and Lee Remick. And they're a family who are loggers in the Northwest. And they're attempting to move their cut trees down the river to the mill. And a labor union tries to stop them. And they fight them and win. It's hard to believe, lefties, Paul Newman and Henry Fonda in an anti-union movie, but it is. And it's a great movie. Sometimes a Great Notion and On the Waterfront. Those are few and far between, but those are themes that are certainly complementary and compatible to the freedom of association libertarian view on labor relations.
All right, well, let's wrap it up with one final thought. And I know we've discussed the minimum wage in the past, but I don't think we can have a program on Labor Day without discussing the minimum wage, that this really is the great destroyer of labor. It locks out of the labor market everybody whose labor is valued at less than the arbitrary minimum. It prevents people from competing on the basis of cost, where, let's say, black teenagers in the inner cities, there's a chronic unemployment rate of 30 to 40%. That's because of minimum wage laws. That if they were able to offer their labor for, let's say, $5 an hour, then employers all of a sudden have to say, hey, man, I can make higher profits if I hire that guy. I'm willing to hire him at $5. And then that gets their foot in the door where they learn work skills and how a business operates. It gets them into the labor market where they get work skills and experience that then enable them to ask for a higher wage a year from them. But what happens with the minimum wage, like with these black teenagers in the inner cities, it locks them out of the labor market totally, where they end up going into the drug trade or some other nefarious activity. So the best thing that labor could ever do, especially poor people in this country, is oppose a minimum wage, Richard.
I totally agree. The ultimate effect of minimum wage laws is to price young people, unskilled, out of the labor market. In fact, anyone who the employer views as giving a value to his firm, that is a value added to help him make a product that he hopes to sell to a willing consumer in the future, if the minimum wage is set above what the employer thinks that worker's contribution is worth, he's being priced out of the market. Now, the fact is, none of us pays more for what we think something is worth. You go into the department store and you're looking through the clothing section. You see a shirt, a pants, a suit, whatever. And you say, gee, this looks good. You even try on the jacket. It seems to look good in the mirror. But then you look at the tag and you say, ouch. And you sometimes put it back on the hanger and on the rack and walk away because you consider that the price is greater than what you think that jacket is worth, where the price is what you have to give up of other things to buy it. Now, the employer is in the same position. He has no income to pay a worker his salary other than the revenue he earns from selling a product. He cannot, at the end of the day, incur expenses, including a worker's wage, greater than what he anticipates he'll have as compensation from consumers who might buy the product, as we talked about earlier. He could be wrong than what he thinks consumers will compensate in buying a product at some point in the future. Any resource, including labor, that seems to be priced above what the value of that product is, in the eyes of the consumer, as reflected in the entrepreneur or businessman's demand for it, will remain unsold on the shelf, on the rack, like an unsold jacket in a department store, because the buyer thinks it's not worth as much as the government has mandated he has to pay to buy that worker's labor services. That is deadly. It is devastating. As you just said, it means that the unskilled, uneducated individual doesn't have a chance to get his foot on the bottom rung of the ladder. And therefore, if he can't get his foot on the bottom rung of the ladder, how is he ever going to climb up to have acquired on-the-job skills, training, people skills to interact with other workers or at retail with consumers to maybe eventually rise up to a higher quality of work and therefore to be worth more to a prospective employer. That's why you see youth unemployment in Greece, 50%, Spain, 40%, Italy, 30%. That is one of the costs of, in the name of doing good, creating disaster.
Yeah, and you know, people sometimes ask us, oh, well, isn't this cruel that you would let people work for $2 an hour? Well, no, it's not cruel at all. I mean, there's a reason why somebody would work for $2 an hour. You know, why are these nice, well-to-do college students, why do they work for free on internships in Washington, D.C.? You know, nobody's paying them even $2 an hour.
Right.
They do it to learn the skills, to put on their resume, get some experience that then makes them more marketable as time goes on. And the same applies for somebody living in the inner city that works for $2 an hour. He may have to live at home. He may have to to scrimp. But here he is learning that business. When I see people like at McDonald's that sometimes get denigrated as an entry-level job, I see what they learn how to do that cash register. They learn how to be nice to customers. They learn that the customer is always right. They learn how to deal with other employees. They learn how the business operates. They're learning all kinds of skills that then they use as a springboard to get better jobs in the future. Richard, we're about out of time, but I thought I'd mention our Austrian Economics project. The book that you've done, Austrian Economics and Public Policy for the Future of Freedom Foundation, is a fantastic book, and that's being reflected in initial sales of the book. It's in the top 10 in 2 different categories on Amazon, one on economic theory and the other on political freedom. And so that's doing fantastic. And then the video series, we're getting fantastic feedback. We published the Part 2 yesterday, so everybody that hasn't seen Part 2, it's there on our website, and along with Part 1, it's a 9-part fantastic series on introducing people to the principles of Austrian economics. And it's not just for beginners. You'll find that if you already know pretty much about Austrian economics, this is a really nice refresher course. So things are looking really good with this project, Richard, and I want to thank you again for doing it for the Future of Freedom Foundation.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for your support and participation in it.
All right. Well, on that note, we'll wrap it up. And thank you again for tuning in. And, Richard, thank you for joining me another week for Libertarian Angle.
Until next time.
All right. And we'll see you next week.